Hello and welcome to Film Ireland Podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm here with Wayne Byrne, Irish journalist and book writer. Wayne, will you introduce our special guest that we have here today?
We have Nick Mclean Sr., who one of my favourite cinematographers of all time and a co-author of a book that's going to be coming out at the end of this year.
And tell us why we're having this conversation. Nick, you've come over, Wayne has dragged you all the way over to Ireland. And you have a few dates in Dublin, Cork, Kildare.
Galway.
Can we get those dates out of the way first,
yeah.
And we'll talk about them again at the end, and then we'll get into a big conversation about Nick's career.
So the first ones up are, we have two events on in Cork on the 8th of March. So we're going to be down in the Triskel Arts Centre. 6:15, there's going to be a screening of Short Circuit, followed by a Q&A with me and Nick, where we're going to talk about the making of the movie. We're going to talk about Nick's career. And then I think at 9 o'clock, there's going to be a screening of Cobra, and we're going to be introducing that, which should be a lot of fun.
Favourite of mine.
Really?
Absolute classic.
Really?
Well, in that fun kind of way.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Wayne, tell me about how you met Nick. I think that's a good way to get into the conversation.
Yeah, well, I was writing a book on Burt Reynolds, who was, one of my favourite film stars of all time, probably my favourite. And I thought, if we're going to be talking about the making of all these great movies that he did, you can't not have Nick Mclean in there, because you're so crucial to his career. Such a long association, almost 40 years, so many movies, TV shows. And I got in contact with Nick, and at one stage we were talking, and I said to Nick, he has all these great stories. I said, why is there no book on your career? There should be several tomes on your career, Nick. Mm-hmm. And he said, if anyone was ever going to do it, he'd like it to be me, which I thought was
absolutely
very sweet. And I said, let's do it.
Was he good at courting you, Nick?
He was great. In fact, just before we started talking about Burt Reynolds, another friend of mine said, you got to, because at these lunches, I usually come up with some good stories. He says, you got to get a book written on you, So it was in the back of my mind. So after I, was talking to Wayne and enjoyed him as a filmmaker, I thought, when he proposed it, I said, let's do it. Let's, and it's amazing. The stuff that I'd forgotten that he brought back, just old memories and stuff. And
well, there's yourself, you have a son who's a camera op as well.
Yes.
And a stepfather and grandfather who are also part of this legacy.
That's correct. My stepfather, Fred Jackman Jr., was a pretty well-known cinematographer, and my grandfather was the first or second president of the ASC, the American Society of Cinematographers, which is pretty good. And I used to actually hang out at the clubhouse, the ASC clubhouse, when I was like 10 or 12, just amidst all these cinematographers. So it was kind of in my blood also.
So do you say the bug was pretty early?
The bug was, but I kind of wanted to be a professional athlete. So I kind of went that route. At high school, I got like scholarships to any college I really wanted to go to. So I broke it down to USC, which is, in Southern California, and Notre Dame. And they took me back to Notre Dame. And, you couldn't have a car. There was no girls on campus. The lights go out at 9 o'clock. So I went to USC. But it came out that I realized that I wasn't as good a football player as I thought I was, and my grades were going down. And one of my teammates said, there's a great class in cinema, the cinema department. It just started up. So when I took that class, I knew within about a half an hour that's what I wanted to do. So then I went back to my stepfather and started the process.
Which was?
I thought because of the nepotism, I'd get right in. But because of the union, you had to have 30 days in 1 year, and every union member had to be working first. So practically the first day I asked my stepfather, the next day I got a call. But I only got 9 days in that year. And you have to have 30 days in any year. The next year I got 1 day. And I was, I loved it so much then, after working 9 days, that, I couldn't wait for the call. And then I get one day the next year. And then the following year, a friend of mine knew I was trying to get in. He had a show going to Stockton. So he said, let's just put your name on the list and see if we can get you in there. And luckily, there was a guy in the union by the name of Gerald McClean. My first name is George McClean. So the union thought I was Gerald McClean. And they didn't balk it. And I got my 30, I probably got 40 days. They had to take me. So I just lucked out 100%.
And you needed it despite
absolutely
the legacy there.
Yeah.
What was that? Again, another big break for you probably was meeting Vilmos Zsigmond.
Absolutely. I was working at Universal, and 2 movies were up. They needed second assistants. and one was for Hitchcock, and the other one was for Jimmy Goldstone, which was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a lot of altitude. And they wanted a young guy that could get around pretty good, like I used to do. And so I got to Red Sky at Morning, and I had known Jimmy Goldstone, the director. And all of a sudden, there's this little Hungarian guy that could barely speak English. And a lot of people were making fun of him. He couldn't speak too well. And I just kind of befriended him. I was nice to him. The other guys were kind of picking on him, really. But you'd go to dailies at night and see the lighting change from the old, bright Hollywood style. And he would, it looked like real life. You thought this guy's going to make it, So it was kind of fun.
And just to get you back in the conversation, because you've been quiet for so long. What did you spot in Nick's work that really kind of spoke to you as being part of what? Obviously, you got into his work through Burt Reynolds initially.
Yeah. Well, there's the academic side of it in terms of just the great cinematography, the great films that he's worked on. So I'm looking at it from a film history point of view as well, and a film criticism point of view, because in the book I'm going to be talking about the movies and their place in film history. And because Nick has such a huge place in film history because of all that work, so there's that angle of it as well. But also it's the personal side of it. It's the relationships that you've had with all these directors and actors. It's such a huge thing for me because I never wanted to write truly just an academic book. I find academic books can be very dry. So in any book I do, I always try and find a kind of a personal angle on them. And there's more than enough here because he's had those great relationships with Hal Ashby, Burt Reynolds, people like that.
When we were first about halfway through the movie on Red Sky and Morning, Vilmos said to me, he said, "I just got offered a movie in Canada. Would you be interested in going with me?" He says, kind of an unknown director. I said, "What's his name?" He says, "Robert Altman." And Altman was a nothing. MASH, I think, was just coming out about halfway through the movie. So Altman became this huge star, but nobody, when we were going up there, nobody had heard of him. And then the lighting he did on McCabe and Mrs. Miller was like unheard of.
And again, if anyone doesn't know that film is Snow.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a huge challenge.
Yeah. However, a lot of it, the falling snow is fake. It's lab. Because we got, I think, 4 feet of snow in one day. It was like you guys had yesterday here, But it was really a lot. And then they had to, when the storm went away, we had to augment, and you can kind of see it when you know where it is what the lab put in there.
Again, Altman's style seems a bit freewheeling to people who kind of look at it kind of in a relaxed way. It seems to just make itself. I don't think that's true. What were the challenges for working with someone like Altman, for instance?
Altman was you had to be on top of everything, and even like what you're saying, he was like new innovator. In the old days, you couldn't overlap in sound. If you overlapped it, cut, let's do it again, because you're stepping on the other guy. Altman loved it. He said, "No, that's the way real life is," which is true, So we could overlap and stuff like that. And I think the challenges with Vilmos and Altman, they love long lens stuff. And for an assistant cameraman, that's really, really tough, especially with no light. It's a big deal with zooming and focusing. It's you got to be right on the, you got inches, to get a sharp focus, So I think that was part of it with Altman.
It's interesting that you could say, he loved his sound. He really understood sound.
Yeah.
And he also developed a few systems of recording for that film. I think it came out most.
Really?
Wasn't that true, Wayne? You can back me up on that?
Too sure now about them.
Yeah, well, just because he was able to overlap because he made sure he recorded each voice individually.
Yeah, and they would put mics all over the place, and that was like the first time, when a guy walk away from the mic, you kind of hear it go down. It was real, he was...
That became his style and his signature, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Was he also creating a big freedom for the actors in that shooting style?
Absolutely. And a great story about that was Warren Beatty was just the opposite. He was like, he had to have everything 100% correct. And one Friday night, we're all wanting to get off, for the weekend. And here's the scene. He's in a hot tub and he's drunk and his arm is up on the hot tub. And his arm drops in the water splashes in his face, and it wakes him up. That's the scene. We were there at midnight, still doing it. Warren would get out and do push-ups and do... Altman left on about take 4. He says, "I got what I want. You guys go do what you want to do."
heard that story. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
It's a true story.
So I don't think you worked with Warren much after that, even though he made a fantastic
I did
film.
Actually, I did Heaven Can Wait.
Oh,
Warren.
you did. You did. All right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, so what was that experience like? Because that was Warren directing.
It was Warren and Buck. Buck was one of my tennis partners, Buck Henry, who was an incredible guy. But it was okay. Once Warren got the confidence in me, then he tested me a lot at the start with stuff. And I remember one time he was coming down the stairway and he had a scarf around his neck, and the scarf wrapped around this thing and ripped it off his deal. And he went out of the room like that, and he came back and he said, "Did you cut the camera?" I said, "No." He said, "Oh God, thank you." So, I mean, normally when something like that, you'd cut, but I never cut unless they said cut,
Which is, that's
right.
sacrosanct, isn't it?
Exactly.
And that's two films of completely different style. Heaven Can Wait and The Kate and Mrs. Miller. And this is the one guy who's working on them. And that's the great thing about your work as well, is that you cross all these different styles and aesthetics and genres as well. Right. Which is, again, it's interesting for me as a film historian to capture.
And do you have a favourite? Would you just say the work relationship you look for, or a kind of film that you like to shoot?
I think most of all, I just usually took what I was offered. If it was a good deal and it was good people, I didn't pretty much think about that too much. If the people were good and the script was good, I just took it and see what happens. You pretty much never knew what was going to happen, anyways.
And with Burt, you met Burt through Cannonball 2, was it?
No, I met Burt on Sharky's Machine. I was the camera operator on that. And what happened with that is the first day I met him, I used to do a lot of aerials, helicopter stuff. So Burt had this shot that he wanted me to do. It was impossible. He had to, in fact, I didn't want to tell him, but I said, if you want to do this part of it, we got to be flying backwards at this deal. So I talked him into doing it a different way. But at the end of it, we got right next up, it's a round building in Atlanta called the Peachtree Plaza. There's an outside elevator. And Burt wanted me to catch it with like a 50 millimeter lens and take it all the way up to the top until the elevator opened. And that was going to be his cut. So it was really difficult because the winds were blowing like crazy. And with this 35 millimeter, whatever I had to have because of the amount of light, I couldn't zoom or anything like that. The helicopter had to be right next to the blades were within 10 feet of the building. Wow. So Burt went with us for the first 3 or 4.
Ricky Hawley
was the pilot who died was one of my best friends, and he died on Runaway Train as a helicopter pilot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just a great, great guy. But he was an old Vietnam pilot, and he was incredible. That's all I can say. I did 1 million shots with Ricky that were.
So do you fly?
I do. I've actually soloed, but I'm the kind of guy that still runs out of gas in my truck, so I don't figure on pilot material.
Those meter things mean nothing to you,
right?
Energy,
right? Yeah, I always thought, but one of the biggest thrills of my life was soloing. That was incredible. When the guy finally steps out and you got it, you think, geez, I want this? So
you kind of did a lot of stunt. You were a great for a stuntman filmmaker. As a cameraman, you got the athletic attitude. Right. And as you told me earlier on, you've been mountain biking and wrecking yourself on mountains. Yes. You can't blame the mountain. So right. That kind of really appealed to that high adrenaline attitude of yours. It absolutely did. I loved helicopter work. I actually did the aerial unit on the right stuff too, the air-to-air. I only watched it 2 weeks ago. Oh, really? I did all that. It's an amazing film. Yeah, it really is. And that stuff the aerial stuff in that film is phenomenal. Yeah, I don't think I've seen anything in a film with the advantage of CGI that has that visceral energy. I had a B-25 where I have to crawl down the fuselage, and in the B-25 in the war they had that plastic deal with the gun. Well, there was no plastic there was no gun. It was just 10,000 feet, and I hook up and I get right to the edge there. I had an Aeroflex, and then I had communications with the F-104 pilots, F-104, and I tell them to rotate, and they'd be about 3,000 feet below me, and they just, hit the afterburner, and before I could zoom back from a 250 to 25, they'd be gone past me. You just see the bottom of the jet in your lens. So it was really, really pretty cool. And it was amazing looking stuff. It did come out real good. And the toughest shot in the right stuff for me was we had to fly a Learjet into the afterburner of a F-104.
And I had like a 75 millimeter on it. So we had to be right next to the plane, not right next to it, but probably within 25 or 30 feet. And the pilot, our pilot says, when he hits that afterburner, it's going to knock you right out of the air. So he hit it, and we were stable for, you see it turn red. And it kind of knocked us out of the air. And I thought, phew, thank God, it's over with. And then the pilot of ours, they said, we got to do it again. He had a monitor up there, so let's go back and do it again.
How many times did you do it?
We did it 2, I think. Okay. 2 or 3, yeah.
It's not one you want to be doing on your 5th go.
I worried about that. I worried about it for a week before I got there.
So Burt obviously was impressed with your ability to problem solve that for starts.
Right.
And he knew what kind of guy you were.
Yeah.
Also, you're both ex-footballers. Let's face it.
That was the connection helps. At the start.
Yeah.
Because he played for Florida State and I played for USC. So which were kind of rivals. But yeah, we kind of respected each other through the football. That really was the key, actually.
It's funny, Hollywood seemed to rely on ex-footballers a lot back in the 60s and the 70s to get some really good actors.
Yeah, right.
Jim Brown.
Yeah, John Wayne.
Burt Reynolds. John Wayne.
To get the work done.
Yeah. John Wayne played at USC.
So from that, you went to your first work as a cinematographer, DOP, was Stroker Ace.
That's correct. And how I got that, and I was telling Wayne earlier today, Burt and I were in a room doing a 1,000 millimeter lens across this hotel, and they were lighting over there. So we were just talking about football and stuff like that. So as he was leaving the room, he said, he was talking about Deliverance. And I said, well, Vilmos made me a camera operator. And he looked right at me. He says, well, I'm making you a DP, the cinematographer. And he walked out of the room.
Wow.
That was it. And at the time, I was dating Sally Field's sister. I think I told you this earlier. And I went back and she said, he doesn't lie about stuff like that. And 6 months later, there's a script. And that doesn't happen to a camera operator. I mean, to be promoted on a big feature, like a Burt Reynolds feature. So
in that way,
it was just like, I totally lucked out. It was.
What was that experience like for you?
It was scary as hell. I could do it now probably with my eyes closed because it was 80% exterior and it's hard to screw that up. And some interior stuff like that. But every day was a nightmare waiting for the lab reports to come back and stuff like that. But I think I knew more than I thought I knew. So, I was doing pretty, I could.
There's a lot of car chases and a lot of highly technical stunt work in it.
Yeah. There always is around Burt. And of course, Needham was the director. And he loves stunts, that's for sure.
Was that after Smokey? That wasn't it? It
was, yeah. Yeah, Smokey was 77, Stroker Ace was 83.
Right.
And you've worked with another big thing you did with Burt was that he convinced you to do Evening Shade, which was his first foray into sitcom and television.
Absolutely did not want to do Evening Shade. I wanted to stay doing movies, but I had just turned about 50. And Burt, how could I turn him down? He said, actually he didn't ask me. He kind of told me I was going to do Evening Shade. And within about 2 months, I said, this is for me. I love doing movies, but I'd done so much for such a long time. And this was so easy. I hate to say it, but it was easy. And I could do films.
Supposed to say that.
I could do films in the summertime. So I thought this is great. So I think we did 100 and some Evening Shades.
Would you agree then with that kind of the TV scenario? Once you've set it up and you know where everything is, it's simply a matter of replicating it?
It's pretty easy. And unless you have like swing sets or something, or have to go outside or stuff like that. In fact, I was taking a meter reading one time in the main set of Evening Shade. And I went out there and I said 5.6 or something. And the guy said, is that the same as 3 years ago? I said, yeah, it is.
But actually, way down to this, you were saying about Evening Shade that it was a benchmark in terms of bringing a more filmic look to sitcom.
Yeah.
Aesthetically speaking, I mean, it's one of the things that stood out to me watching it was, here's a sitcom in 1990. And you have Steadicam shots in there. I mean, there's a scene in an episode where there's a high school reunion, and it's a single shot which follows Burt around the gymnasium, and he meets somebody and they have a dance, but the camera is circling them. Do you remember that, Nick?
Yeah, of course.
And it just stood out.
That's quite extravagant.
That was the first time Steadicam ever came into a sitcom or anything like that. But Burt would let us do it.
Yeah, just for me, it stood out as something that I'd never seen before in a television sitcom like that. And I just thought, God, Nick is changing the cinematic landscape of television as well as all that great stuff he did in the 70s and 80s. Now he's just doing all this.
I could also dump the light as much as I wanted, because Burt would back me. If you had Burt backing you, say, yeah, they might say it's a little bit too dark, but it's actually a little more artistic. It looks good to us, and then we started getting known for that stuff.
And B.L. Stryker, another. Well, they were TV movies, but I mean, they're so stylish.
Yeah.
And you had some great directors on that as well. Fraker even directed the first episode. Hal Needham did an episode. Burt did several.
I directed one too.
That's right.
Right, yeah.
High Rise,
Yeah,
which is one of the best ones.
And in that, the one I directed, Burt was supposed to come into this building and save the day, but I wanted to put a mask on him. That way we could use a second team and let Burt have a few days off, so he loved that. So we did that, when we doubled him.
Tricks.
Yeah, right.
Give the boss a few days off.
Yeah, for sure.
So most of your television stuff at that point was with Burt, but it did lead to Friends as well, which is a big deal because it's slightly different in that it's a multi-camera show. Was it even shot multi-camera at times?
Yes, it was 4 cameras at all times.
So
except
Friends was no stretch for you, really.
It was not, and I was doing, it was kind of I did 4 years of Sybil, which was all girls, and I was kind of getting known for that. And then my career was starting to fade a little bit. So I took, which happens, and I took this, or I was offered this series called Veronica's Closet.
Kirstie Alley.
Kirstie Alley. So I was doing that. Luckily, the same producers, and we were stage 25 at Warner Brothers, and they were stage 24. So one day their cinematographer didn't show up for some reason. They came over and they said, "Will you check the lighting?" And they kind of liked the way I worked. And so at the end, I went and did like 4 of them. I did both. I'd just walk across the street and do. And at the end of the year, they offered me the show. And I did the last 100 episodes or something like that, which was fun.
Someone didn't turn up for work.
Right. Exactly. It's it can be lucky.
That happened for you twice, though.
Yeah, right. Sure.
But what do you think the artistic, let's talk about art, not just crap, but the art of what the cinematographer brings? It's not just that you light everything up so everybody can see what's going on. You are bringing the mood to it. You
absolutely have to bring the mood. Once you read the script, you kind of get in your mind how you want to light it, what you want to look like, or what it wants to look like, and where it can be real dark. In fact, Vilmos always said also, you should always have something really, really bright in the frame and really, really dumped, really black, which is a pretty interesting concept for his compositions. He always tried to line up. And being the camera operator for Vilmos, once he would line up a shot, I'd be the next guy to look through it. So I think I took after his composition, which isn't bad. He was quite an artist. So I kind of got that feel.
How did he work with Hal Wallace, considering Hal Wallace was the old school of Hollywood kind of thing?
Hal Wallace never said a word. He just sat in he had a big rocking chair in dailies, and he was the one that produced the first where I met Vilmos. But when you start looking at the stuff, and it looks real instead of, overlit old Hollywood style, and you think, Jesus, that he never said much, but you could tell that everybody was getting on to Vilmos. He had brought this whole new, he and László Kovács, they came together from Hungary. So you could see that people were starting to like this and that. And we got offered, a bunch of stuff after that, did some real good films.
And László came along and, Easy Rider in the last movie. And that in itself, I mean, the movies that you and Vilmos were working on, and then László, it changed the cinematic landscape. It was the new Hollywood.
Yeah, between the copycats are everywhere after that.
Yeah. One good story about László is we were at László's house one night. László, Vilmos, Peter Yates, who did Bullet, and Peter Yates wanted to hear
who lends Bullet.
Fraker. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
But he wanted to know what the Escape from Hungary was from Vilmos and László. So we got the wine out, and we're getting a little loaded, and the stories are coming, and there's a knock at the door. And they open the door. It's Spielberg. So Spielberg doesn't know what we're doing. So he comes in, sits down, and he hears what the story is. He said, "Wait a minute, I got to go get my tape recorder." So nobody said anything. He just, he said, he came back in, and away he went. But the stories were magnificent of these two guys that were kind of changing Hollywood, and they loved operating their own camera too, which was unheard of and un-union-like and stuff like that. But luckily, once I became Vilmos' operator, I said, I'm not going to do it unless you know, I do it.
Because it was technically trouble for them if the wrong person saw them doing it.
Absolutely. No, it was a fine. It was a giant fine, yeah.
And is it more accepted nowadays, or is it still...
I think it is a little more accepted now. In fact, I think Spielberg operates his own camera most of the time. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But look at what these guys were doing as well in Sugarland Express. You know, capturing the lens flares and using that as an artistic device,
right?
Which is now a thing, you know, in cinema.
Yeah, well, László, again, wasn't he? Everyone was slagging him off for Easy Rider.
Yeah.
For all these all those old school guys were looking at.
Oh yeah! Oh my God! Yeah.
And now no one thinks about it. Everyone goes looking for it. And then J.J. Abrams drowns this
the flares.
Yeah, that he's done in post production.
Right. I actually got a memo from the camera department at Universal one time that said, anybody that's responsible for a flare, you're liable to get fired. And now, you know, 2 or 3 years later,
they're looking for it.
They're looking for it, exactly, yeah.
But again, it's just a show. You see it used in the right way and the wrong way.
Exactly.
It's like any aesthetic.
Right, exactly.
Anyone if you're breaking the rules, do it properly.
Exactly.
Well, there's one particular shot in the Sugarland Express. It's near the end of the film, and it starts out on a close-up of Goldie Hawn, and it pulls back to the car travelling along, and there's a couple of strands of flares there.
Yeah.
And it's just one of the most beautiful shots.
Yeah,
in that whole
she's
period.
all backlit. Yeah.
And that film itself is kind of, I always felt it was inspired a little bit by Easy Rider, by the attitude.
Probably was, yeah.
A lot of films came around after Easy, like Vanishing Point.
Right.
And then that one, a bit more kind of like the family version almost.
Yeah. Right.
It was based on a true story.
It was a true story,
roughly,
yeah. In fact, we saw the pictures of the car when it got, at the end when it got all shot up. And Steven bought that car. It's called 2311 in the movie. And Steven has it in his garage to this day. So I think. I haven't seen him for a while, but he might still.
He'll sell it when he needs the money.
Yeah, right.
Just to bring up some other directors that you worked with, and I'd like to go back to Burt again, because obviously we talked about some. But you also worked with Hal Ashby.
I loved Hal Ashby.
Tell us about your experience with Hal Ashby.
Well, I did being there with Hal Ashby, and I think we didn't have through the lens video in those days. So Hal relied on me, everything. You know, I know we actually did have through the lens, but he was just like this kind of guy that.
Did he generate a lot of stock when he was on set?
Stock?
As in, like, sorry, a lot of film.
Yes. In fact.
Because he was an editor.
And he was.
He came from that background. And
exactly. And he did Thomas Crown Affair, I think, the first Thomas Crown Affair.
Yeah.
But we would have dailies. I never did dailies like this before. In the basement of that mansion, there was a bowling alley, so we had our daily set up down there. But I've never seen it before. He'd go A reel, B reel. He had 2 projectors, and he'd look at the first master. Instead of going through 8 masters or something like that, he'd say, "Billy, just go to the next reel," and then he'd reload this camera, so we'd get all the good, we know exactly what it looked like. We didn't have to go through all the stuff.
He was editing in his head.
He was editing, exactly. That's what he was doing. And my last story about Hal Ashby was he asked me to do a camera on the Rolling Stone concert. And so we went up there, and Caleb Deschanel was the cameraman, and halfway through the earphones, they say, "Hal Ashby wants to talk to you." So I said, so I worked my way back, and we had for one of the first trucks with monitors through the camera monitors, and I go in, and Hal had an IV in his arm, laying in a chaise lounge. I said, "What the hell?" He says, "When I get around the Stones, I party too hard." And then he said, "Will you take me home after this?" Because he lived close to me. And
get me away from Keith Richards.
Right.
Dangerous for your health.
Yeah. But he was excellent. He's just a great guy.
And also Schlesinger, is it Schlesinger or Schlesinger? Schlesinger.
I think
John Schlesinger, Marathon Man is a film you worked on as well.
Absolutely. I love that man.
William Goldman, writer.
Yeah.
Was he very hands-on working with Schlesinger on that film?
I didn't see much of him, but, Sir Laurence Olivier was in it, Dustin, and it goes on and on. Conrad Hull shot it, he's like one of the best of all time. So it was a great time. We really had a good time. Did some good stuff too.
Did you find it, again, the work relationship with Conrad Hull would have been more formal, being of the older stock, the older...
Yeah, he was kind of, he was from the old, but he was kind of bendable. His lighting was incredible too. So he was right along with the other guys with low lighting. And I had lunch with Conrad every day for 2 or 3 months or as long. And every day at lunch, he'd say the same thing. We'd go to dailies first, then to lunch. He said, "I've lost it. I I don't have it anymore. And I'd be looking at the stuff, and God, it's absolutely gorgeous.
You worked with Richard Brooks on Looking for Mr. Goodbar,
I
didn't
did,
you?
yeah.
Which is stunningly shot.
Right.
And the light, if you've ever seen the last scene in that movie.
That was a strobe deal, too, that we didn't know it was going to come out,
Diane Keaton and a young Mel Gibson, I think, floating around the frame there.
Yeah, stunning.
But, or is it Richard Gere?
Richard Gere.
Richard Gere.
Right.
Don't know why I said Mel Gibson. But I can't believe that he would say that. This guy who'd done so much.
He said
insecurity.
All he wanted, he bought a book. He had the rights to some book. That's all he could talk about was directing, and never got to do it. But I don't know whether you know it, but Conrad Hall's dad wrote Mutiny on the Bounty. And when I went to Tahiti, I visited their house, and Conrad was like the most renowned American that lived in Tahiti, or off and on. And he had his own island there, too.
Oh, wow.
Little island, yeah. But yeah.
When he was busy losing it, he was
right.
getting enough money to buy an island.
Right. He was great. He was just terrific.
So of your own work, cinematographer in cinema, what is the favorite film that you worked on?
I would say the one that looks the best was City Heat with Burt and Clint Eastwood. But
again, that's a 1930s.
Yeah,
set
30s, 40s,
film.
something like
and
that.
And it is a beautiful looking film.
Yeah, it came out real good.
In fact, it's one thing that sticks out for me most is how lush it is.
Really?
It's a gorgeous film.
And it was right, I think, when this high-speed film came out, so I could dump the light. So I was keying at like 5-foot candles, which was unheard of in those days. The old-time guys were keying at 200-foot candles. And I got...
That was a big deal at times. What year was that?
84.
84,
yeah, that's about right. So, yeah, and I had good control of the lab, and, I'd get to go in and see what I'd done before I go back to... We worked a lot of nights on that thing, so I kind of knew where I was photographically.
In terms of the director on that film, it was originally supposed to be Blake Edwards, and then it became Richard Benjamin. How did you find working with Richard Benjamin, considering he had only done 2 films?
He was a very, very nice guy, but Clint really directed it. Anytime Clint's on the set, he's the director. That's all, because he really knows it. But Richard was great, and we had a lot of fun with him.
Yeah.
But really, Clint was the guy that called the shots on that.
Didn't Richard Benjamin do My Favorite Year?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
He did.
He's
And he's a great guy too.
A nice actor as well.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
How does that work though when you got the director trying to look like they're doing their job and the actor just?
I think before you get on something like that, you know it.
Yeah.
So if you take the job, or I don't know whether he and Clint talked, but they probably did.
And it was a very unusual project for Eastwood at the time, wasn't it? Because the broad comedy thing was just starting with him.
Yeah.
I don't think he'd done the Which Way movies by it.
He did, yeah. Yeah, them
He did.
done.
Okay.
But that's it's in the Eastwood canon, it's a strangely stylish film, because he doesn't tend to shoot films like that very
Right.
often, overly stylish films. He's kind of known as an economical director. But very few of his films are, have that very distinctive looking style.
For Clint, you usually rolled on the rehearsal.
Yeah.
And many times you printed the rehearsal.
Yeah.
And that was it.
I heard that, yeah.
And yeah.
You still had some beautiful cinematography along the way in some films.
Absolutely. In fact, my gaffer, Tommy Stern, went after I was done with Clint, or Clint was done with me. Tommy went on like a couple of films after that. I think he got nominated once or twice for stuff he'd done. So,
tell me how you got involved in the Goonies.
I'll tell you exactly. This is a pretty good story too. I had to go to dailies of something else, and Spielberg was there, and I think Spielberg was touting me to Richard. So we had that deal, and the next day, Richard calls me into his office, and he said, "I want to give you the script of the Goonies." I said, "Great." So I went right out in my car and I read it. And an hour later, I came back into the room and told Jenny, his secretary, I said, "I love it." And Donner heard me. And he said, "Come in here, kid." He said, "You read that script already and you love it?" He said, "Welcome, Goonie." Just like that. I got the picture. Pretty.
Well, I don't think you know. Donner was must have very aware of your work before.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah.
And again, just to mark you, Donner would be a little bit ahead of the curve of Spielberg in terms of television.
Oh, yeah.
And my God, he put in so many television errors with Twilight Zone,
right.
Get Smart.
Right.
I know this because I've been watching them recently.
Right.
And a lot of other stuff. I can't even think. I think he didn't do any Outer Limits, but he did a lot. He did a lot of genre stuff. He earned Superman.
He knew what he was doing.
Sorry, you were going to say something?
Actually, on Superman, we were flying up to look at some locations one time, and I said, "Do you ever realize that if Superman looked like hell flying, you're done. And he says, I didn't realize it until I went to the first screening. And then I thought, my God, because he hadn't seen a lot of it. The first time Superman takes off, if it looks, phony or bad or anything.
If it looked like Superman 4.
Right. He's done, so
that was their tagline, remember?
Yeah.
Do you believe a man can fly?
Yeah, right.
But Donner Spielberg, they come close together in the TV circle and Universal work, and then they're working together. I was asking you what the dynamic was like with the two.
Well, it was real great, and as I said before, the first 2 weeks of shooting, Spielberg would call me at night, or I'd get a note to call Steven, and they called Dick too. And in the morning, we'd come together and say, what did he say to you? I said, well, he was criticizing this, and it might have been a shadow that was, and then you get Dick and stuff like that. So about after 3 weeks of this, criticizing every morning, which Steven does, Donner says, I'll fix this. So he says, when we get back to the stage, I'm creating a second unit. We're going to make Steven the director. And we never heard from him again in like months. That was the last time. So he's got to be occupied with, film and whatever's going on. As a genius he is,
A lot of effects in that movie as well that you had to work with, practical and other.
Yes.
And children.
Yes. And we had all those tunnels, And instead of I usually had a painter or two on a job, I had plasterers in that. So if I was hiding a light in, part of the mountain, you'd have to plaster over it. So instead of calling for painters, you'd be calling for plasterers, which was probably, I think I had 2 or 3 plasterers just to hide lights in the tunnel.
But it must be a huge challenge to do pretend dark. For that, and for nearly over half the movie, I think. Well,
actually, what happened was when they go into the tunnels, which that day, like the only day I ever had to reshoot because it was so black we couldn't see anything. So I had to reshoot that. But as you see the movie, when they get down below, they lit some lanterns. And I talked him into doing that. And then when the Fratellis were coming across at the end, they had flashlights built where the back of them were open so the light would come back up into their faces. So I did kind of create a couple of things there, and Donner went for it. He said, okay.
Yeah, but they look gorgeous.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
As I said, that's what you're doing. You're creating wonderful pretend.
Yes.
No one wants to really feel they're in the dark. They want to know that the illusion is there.
When I actually went into Friends too, I took handheld light, little cameras that I could get the gals' faces, and I have 2 guys from my electrical crew just follow them around. And the girls loved it. And it made them look good, too. So it kind of...
Of course they did.
Yeah. They're gorgeous gals.
But that's really interesting. Because that would have been a kind of innovative change, even within the structure of Friends and the style of it. Right. You brought a new style to it. Tell me more about that.
Well, it's just they were around so much, and there was so much light in sitcoms that usually when they were, looking sideways or something like that, if you didn't fill them, most of them have that, So we just fill them
like
in.
Normal people.
Exactly. And so that would just help, and actually when one of my guys would hold up a light and the light was out and he didn't know it because you can't see it, the gals, they'd go up in their lines immediately. If they didn't have that light, they'd say, wait,
they spot it pretty fast.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of what they call the Marlene Dietrichs.
Yeah, exactly. It was just like a little handheld eye light, and you could get around practically anywhere with it.
But it's so true though. If you don't have eyes working properly in any filming at all, the rest of it's not going to work.
Exactly. Yeah, it's true.
Would that be something that you'd really be looking out for all the time before you'd even get anything else right?
Yeah, I try to. And you talk about eyes. Yeah, they're really important. Very, very important. It was kind of essential in a lot of stuff. And sometimes, if you had one eye, depending on the scene and stuff like that, as long as that eye was crisp, you were doing good.
Yeah.
You were Emmy nominated for several episodes.
Yeah, I got nominated for 3, and one was the wedding at the end where Phoebe got married, and I knew I was going to win for that. I had the speech, I had the whole shebang, and nothing. So I'd been 3 years in a row, or maybe every other year. I said, that's it, I'm never going again. But I never got nominated again. So.
And what was it about those particular episodes, do you think?
I think because of the Phoebe deal, it was an outside wedding. We put a lot of Christmas lights and stuff like that. And we had a lot of dry ice and stuff blowing up. And it just looked good. It looked good. It looked crisp. It was, and yeah, it was the outside wedding. I think that was what really, that's why I thought I would get it, for sure.
But still, as someone who creates really good work like that, a lot of the time you're creating work that only your peers are going to spot.
That's correct.
Oh my God, what have you done there?
Yeah.
And yet people go for the fluffy stuff.
Yep, that's right.
So, you're better than the Emmys, okay?
Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah.
But continue let's talk about Mel Brooks. Next week, Monday 11, the Sugar Club, Spaceballs, and you were pulled in by Mel Brooks to work on that. Tell me how that came about.
My favorite story about that is when he was interviewing for Spaceballs. I just finished City Heat, which was dark, it was black. And Mel brought me in and he said, I really like your work, and I think I'm going to give you this job. But kid, see those walls? I want to see them. I pay for those walls. I want to see them. So blast the light in there, which was why Spaceballs was so bright. I just had to do it.
Was he thinking back to old Flash Gordon's as opposed to Star Wars?
Could be.
Where you just see everything that's all flat.
That's exactly what it was. It was just...
That was kind of comedy, though, wasn't it?
It was
the comedy genre.
Yeah, and it was funny to work on it because he, there was a script, but that he and his cohort Ronnie, I forget his last name, was one of his writer friends. They'd go over, whatever lines they were. They say, well, let's change it from. They change everything right there and then, and it usually worked most of the time with it. And I love to. Mel Brooks didn't like to take any ideas from anybody else, which I love. So I used to always get guys to say, well, if you think that would help Mel, why don't you go tell him? And he'd go berserk. Get him out of here. Get him off this set. I don't want this. Yeah.
Well, considering he wrote, many more credits on that? He did have a lot of other writers working with him at the start in those films.
Yeah, I think so. And he's pretty much of a genius. But at Spaceballs, he was kind of in a lull. And then the big play that went to New York came out after that, and he became a huge hero.
Yeah, he kind of started dusting off some of his old gems.
Yeah.
But what was he like to do as a director?
He was great.
Not able to take.
He was great.
Advice.
I didn't have too many lighting challenges on it, but camera challenges I had. I think I always had 2 cameras, or 1 camera and a Steadicam doing most of the stuff though. So we were pretty well covered in there, and I didn't have to make it look that good. There was a couple scenes that had to look pretty good, couple dark scenes, but it was fun.
So looking back, television or cinema, which do you think would you prefer?
Oh, I think the films. I'm still a big film. That's why I got along with Wayne so well. That he's incredible film student, and just
I know. I've learned a few things myself.
Just the stuff that I knew, that he'd bring up, and about my career and stuff like that. I thought, this guy knows what he's doing. So we had to.
And you've got the book coming out hopefully early next year, like this year?
Hopefully the end of this year, in around that, yeah.
Well, how did you find the process of talking about yourself for the book? And did it reignite old memories?
It totally reignited old memories. And he knew stuff about me that I had forgotten. So, and I got, would get on stories and he'd have a rough time getting me off Skype, just keep talking. It was really interesting to see all that stuff come back up.
Nick's the kind of subject you want, though. You know what I mean? He's great stories. He's willing and open to talk, which is just a dream for me as a co-author. Just to. And
did you so obviously you didn't find it hard to get the stories out of him, but obviously I get the impression Nick's quite modest. I'm telling you like you're not in the room here, Nick. But and that helps, I think.
Well, you see, I'm ready to call him a genius. I don't know how he'd take
he's been quiet about that, but I think he agrees with you.
Yeah, actually.
So the book for you, what approach and structure are you going to go with this volume on?
It's Q&A is a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like what we're doing here is just talking about the movies, going into each. Now I'm doing each one, so it's going to be
great.
Comprehensive book. You know what I mean?
That's what I'd expect.
So we're starting at the very beginning and going right up to Friends and everything in between. So every film is covered in Nick's career.
He even has my football career in there.
Yeah.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. Oh, we're doing it. It's stopping short of a biography here. But it's.
But then for you, what is one of the more interesting things that we haven't covered that Nick has forgotten about because he's got so much to remember? That for you, talking to Nick about his career. And I'm talking about the early camera days as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, every part of Nick's career is of interest to me. And like I say, the book has kind of taken this film history kind of angle. So, when you start out with Hitchcock and Altman and these guys. It's crucial that you cover them. You know what I mean? As small as your work may have been on Family Plot, the fact that you've worked with Hitchcock is just
I got
amazing.
to work with Hitchcock.
Yeah, I was going to say we forgot to cover Hitchcock.
Would you like a short story?
I'd love a Hitchcock short story.
Okay, here's the story. I was a pretty hot camera operator in Hollywood. So I get a call from his AD, and he said, we're letting our camera operator go, and who was a very good camera operator. But there was something being lost between Hitchcock, the director of photography, and the camera operator. So he said, we're letting him go. Could you come in and audition for Mr. Hitchcock, as a camera operator, which is not, you don't do that. But for Hitchcock, I said, I'll be there in a flash. So I get in there the next morning. It was Family Plot, I believe, and we're doing a bunch of running shots up in the mountains and stuff like that. And Hitchcock was sitting in a Lincoln Continental, and the director of photography would go over to him. His name was Lenny South. And Hitchcock would say, Lenny, I would like a close-up with the top line on top of the head and the bottom line just above the elbow. Well, this is what the other camera operator wasn't hearing. But I would go up and I would listen to see what Hitchcock said, then I know exactly what to do. So I was getting along real good. And you had to dress, too, for Hitchcock. You didn't have to have a tie, but you had to have a coat and a nice, which I was a Levi's guy, So I dressed up, I did a part and all that stuff. And I thought, Jesus, this is amazing. So the last shot of the day, the AD said, there's a car coming down and he's going to go off this cliff. I said, well, where's the other cameras? You're it. Hitchcock hires what he thinks is the best, and you better get it. Yeah, you better get it. So I'm all ready to go, and I'm thinking, Jesus, what if I miss this shot? And now I hadn't said a word to Hitchcock, and he hadn't said a word to me all day. I'm just getting ready to go, and I hear this chair pull up right next to me like this, and I hear the shuffling of feet. This little old man sits down, and just before we get ready to roll, he says, I presume your machine is functioning properly. I swear to God. That's what he said. I presume your machine is functioning properly. In other words, you better not screw this up. And when I finished the shot, I got the shot. He never said a word to me. He just got up and left. And I said to the AD, I said he didn't see. He says he knows by the way that lens moves whether you got it or not. Just so he was that.
Really interesting. So old school.
Yeah, exactly. He never said a word. He just got up and shuffled away afterwards.
Your machine.
Presume your machine is functioning properly. Oh, geez, you better.
So I heard he was pretty strong on budget. It's interesting that he made that film. He made the film quite cheaply, and he got into the goo of working with TV crews through Psycho.
Uh-huh.
And didn't he maintain a bit with that film as well?
He did, yeah.
I watched it last year, and it's an interesting failure.
The Psycho.
No, Family Plot.
Oh,
Family Plot, yeah.
There's some lovely stuff in it. But and you came in for very much towards the end.
I got offered the picture after that, and I couldn't take it. I was starting a picture about 3 days down, so I couldn't take it. But at least I got to. The reason I was there was to work with him. It's just I just wanted to see what it was like.
Do you think you would have survived the movie?
I don't know. I might not have. Yeah.
And John Badham, how did you find working with John Badham? He's a filmmaker I really like.
He was really great.
He's kind of forgotten now, isn't he?
Well, what happened was, is like a lot of people, he skyrocketed. And actually, my son did a couple of TV shows with him lately. He's still working.
Oh, good.
And I had a real nice time with him. He knew what he was doing. He did went right to the top at the start, but then he kind of peaked out.
And Short Circuit, was that an interesting one to work on? Was there any particular stories from that?
Not really a particular story, other than
the damn robot.
The robot. What happened was we had 5 of those robots, one for close-ups, one for speed that would go fast, one, and the number 5, the theme was number 5 is alive. The number 1 most expensive one that we had all tuned up for close-ups and stuff like that, with the battery unhooked, went right off the tailgate of a car or a truck and crashed. And the guy says it's impossible that this happened because the battery was not. So number 5 was alive and crashed.
Well, it beats all those Exorcist and Omen stories where everyone's dropping like flies because they're dealing with the devil.
Yeah.
Well, this man worked on The Exorcist as well. Exorcist 2.
Oh, how did you find Friedkin?
It wasn't Friedkin. It was
Borman.
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 Sorry,
Yeah.
John Borman,
Yeah.
of course. It was an interesting crossover because Burt got to work with Berman on Deliverance.
Right.
You know,
Right.
And Vilmos worked with
Right.
them. I like that movie, I have to say. It's a guilty pleasure of mine.
The
I do think John Berman is wonderfully bonkers, and I really like that about him.
He absolutely is.
Yeah.
In fact, he asked me, I was doing Close Encounters, and he asked me to fly to New York for an interview. And I thought I was hot stuff at the time. I said, I'm not flying to New York for an interview. I went a little time off, and he hired me just because I said that, I guess.
And how did you find working with John?
He was great. He was very knowledgeable, but you could kind of see the movie wasn't going that great. You know, and we had Richard Burton in it also. And at the time, I was not a new camera operator, but with Richard Burton, you didn't want to screw up. So I would wear long sleeve shirts because I'd get to shaking. Well, you know, because he'd say, you know, he was a pretty good drinker. Yeah. And if we didn't get the shot, he said, God, boys, get the, you know. And so I was like, you know, so I just pray I'd get the damn thing. But I remember dressing in long sleeve shirts so he wouldn't check it.
And Fraker shot that movie as well.
Yeah.
Which is very definitive of his style. Fraker used to use a lot of mirrors and kind of shapes within his frames.
Lots of mirrors. Yeah. Fraker was, lots of mirrors.
Very strange film.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how did you find Burton other than being scared?
He seemed okay, except, you know, he didn't want to do it more than once or twice. And then when he came up, we did some up in Arizona, the last part of it, I believe. And he'd start drinking, you know. And I overheard him talking one time. He says, I think I'm an alcoholic. He says, you know, the first couple drinks, I'm fabulous. The next couple drinks, I'm starting to go downhill. By my fifth drink, I'm a total jerk. He said, I go after anybody, you know.
At least he understood.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Wayne, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure for me. I loved it. I'll probably think of a million questions after you've gone.
Oh, of course. That's
the way it was. Thank you so much. And thank you out there for listening. And make sure you check out those dates. I'm sure they're going to be on the same page, so you can check them out again. And please go and see Nick and Wayne wherever they're going to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.